I'm Rachel Schwen. I'm a senior chemist with the Performance Coatings Group's color technology team. We do color for all of the businesses on the industrial coating side of Sherwin-Williams. We're going to talk a little bit about light and how light and color interact with one another. So at a certain point, I'll want you to get up and come and take a look at things. Got several different bulbs up here that we can kind of play with light a little bit. And think about how light affects color and those sorts of things. So I have my contact information in the presentation. As part of Sherwin-Williams, you're more than welcome to contact one of your local Showplace tech reps. They're here for you all the time. Or if you have a color-specific question, I can certainly help you with that as well. So we're going to start with the basics of the basics, because you never know who's going to walk into one of my trainings. I always want to level set and let's say, what is color? And here we're talking about object color specifically. I think that's what most of us deal with every day. There are people who deal specifically with lighting color, but right now we're going to talk about object color. So this is a really precise definition, and it's a little weird. So let's just start here. Color is the brain's interpretation of the eye's sensation of the light reflected back from an object to the eye versus the light emitted by a surrounding light source. As you can see, it's a three-piece puzzle. If you have a breakdown in any one of those three pieces, the color may not look the same. Whether that's you change the light, whether that's you turn the light off, change the object, obviously it's going to change. Or if there's some misinterpretation or disconnect between the sensor in your personal eye, in your brain, or that of your customer or someone else you're comparing to. So let's break each one of these pieces down a little bit. And I think the one that struck most home was about light. So we learn a lot about object color, but we don't necessarily learn about light color. And light color is becoming more and more important in all interior marketplaces because of the advent of compact fluorescents and LEDs, especially in home environments. Customers have a choice that they didn't have before, and it's kind of causing some trickle-down effects for us. So we're just going to talk a little bit about lighting for a while. We'll play with a little bit of lighting, and then we'll talk a little bit more about general color. So what makes a light colored? This is super sciencey, right? We consider visible light to be between 400 and 700 nanometers. It's in that electromagnetic spectrum region. We talk about light as a wave as opposed to a particle. Depending on what industry you're in, you may choose one or the other. In color, we talk about it as a wave. It's just an easier way for us to communicate. White light generally covers an even region of the spectrum, and white is a really general term. And it can be divided into the kind of colors of the rainbow. And the only thing I want to point out here is that violet is not necessarily the same as purple in this context. Purple is actually a color that only exists inside your brain. It doesn't exist in the real world. Purple is a combination of energy that's exciting your long wavelength and your short wavelength cones at the same time, and that's what makes purple. Violet, which is actually a rainbow color, is a really deep blue. It doesn't look like we think of when we say the word violet, right? So it's just a lexicon thing. You can just say purple. Purple works too. What makes a light colored? So white light is can be a combination of colored lights, which when viewed in the eye have a more or less even coverage of the spectrum. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean by that. And this is always the case in a fluorescent or LED light, that it's some combination of colored lights that when viewed in your eye look white. Anything that's a burning substance, so a fire or an incandescent light or a halogen light, those are going to be really smooth, even coverage. But anything that's not those is going to be kind of spiky combinations of colors that come together to make a white light. Most people have kind of experienced warm light or cool light. Are those terms you guys are familiar with? Yeah? The industry is really trying to glom on to like warm and cool light right now as a way to try to help consumers pick light that suits their needs. And in this case, warm light is similar to sunrise, sunset, closer to an incandescent bulb or firelight, whereas cool light is more like the light you would experience outside in the middle of the day. And just some examples. So there's this thing called correlated color temperature, which is actually how we get that warm or cool denotion. And what it comes down to is there's this magical thing called the Planckian locus, which is completely irrelevant for what you're doing. But the picture on the top left shows you a black body curve. A black body is basically something that burns, right? So all things that burn emit some sort of light energy, including our sun, which is a giant burning ball of gas, all the way down to a candle flame or fire. And you know that there's many different colors of fire. If you think of fireworks, for example, you can get almost a full spectrum of colors from fireworks. So there are several different kinds of white light, and they're related to these numbers that are in the thousands, and that's thousands of degrees Kelvin. So from 2,000 degrees to 9,000, I've seen all the way up to 9,000, are different colors of white light. And depending on where you are on that spectrum, the light's going to look either more yellow or more blue, and pass through somewhere in the middle, which is kind of neutral for most people. And it, of course, depends on the individual person, but some people are very comfortable in warm light and some people are not. Most people are used to warm light in interior environments because it's kind of what we grew up with. But it's becoming more and more common for younger generations to have not grown up with this kind of traditional incandescent light in their house. So if you talk to high school students, right, they maybe have had one or two of these kind of lights in their house in their entire lifetime, right? Which is completely different than if I'm talking to the greatest generation, right? The people who are now in their 60s and 70s, they're looking at having lived most of their life with that kind of light, right? Most of us have also lived with these kind of long tube fluorescent lights, especially in our workspaces. They're a little bit different in color. They're usually a little bit less orange, but there's a really wide variety of quality of those lights, which can go from almost pink all the way up to super blue and bright. So depending on which light you're looking at, the objects in that space are going to look different because it's that three-piece puzzle, and every time you change the light, it's going to change that a little bit. So if you look at some of the light bulb boxes, you'll see where it's like dawn to dusk, right? This particular one is soft white. So soft white, warm white, those are kind of similar terms. And then it'll give you a number. This one says 27,000 Kelvin. A regular incandescent lamp is about 2635, so this one's going to be a little bit bluer than a regular incandescent lamp, but it's going to be pretty close. Whereas if I pull a different one like this one says 5,000 Kelvin, which is going to be closer to a daylight lamp. In the paint industry, we use 6,500 Kelvin as our color standard. So everything that we sell to Showplace, we have verified under 6,500 that it's the right color. Once we switch the light, we can't guarantee it's going to be perfect every time, okay? So that's the standard that your company and ours have come to agree is the standard. And the reason we picked that standard is really important. This is what 6,500 Kelvin looks like. This is called a spectral power distribution. It's literally what it sounds like. It's a spectrum of the power distributed for this light source, okay? So this is the visible region, more or less. And you see it's a really kind of smooth spectrum. There's not really very many holes or gaps. There's a lot of energy in the blue area, but there's also still a fair amount in the red. This light source is probably the most neutral white for most observers. So meaning that it doesn't really have a bluish cast. It doesn't really have an orangish cast. It's kind of as neutral white as you can get. It's used as a paint industry standard across almost our entire company. There's probably one exception to that, one of our industries that uses a different light, but for the most part we use this one exclusively. And it allows people to differentiate the most colors. So when you're trying to distinguish between colors or shades of color, this is the one that allows you to see the most shades. So if you, show of hands, anybody do needlework? yarn, needlepoint, scrapbooking, any of those kind of craftier color pursuits. Any of those, they sell specific lights that are these daylight lights for your house so that you can distinguish those different colors. So this is what we use as our standard in the paint industry. There's a reason we don't use these in houses, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. This guy, if I can turn it the right way, there we go, is your standard incandescent bulb. That's this one on the top, Illuminate A incandescent bulb. It's a burning filament, right? It's a tungsten filament, and it burns, which is why they burn out, right? It's also why they create so much heat, is because it's literally burning something. So it's not energy efficient because it's converting a lot of that energy into heat, which isn't great for the fixture itself, and is also not great for their surrounding fixtures, which is part of why we're moving away from incandescent bulbs. As you'll see, it's a really smooth, even distribution of light across the spectrum. However, there's a big problem. There's almost no energy in the blue. There's just nothing there. There are no photons in the blue. So when you look at this light with something white, here I'll grab one of the white panels here, in a white kitchen cabinet, in our whatever fluorescent light this is, looks fairly white. I put it under this, it looks pretty yellow. Okay? Make sense? Because it just doesn't have any energy in that region. So it's going to put a kind of yellowish cast on everything. Tungsten halogens, dichromics, are the same kind of thing. You guys will have probably quite familiarity with tungsten halogens in fixtures. They're used a lot in fixtures. They don't quite look like this. They're not that round bulb shape, but they're kind of more flat on top. They tend to be a little bit cooler color temperature, not quite as yellow, but they are still burning something. So the way they get rid of that is to put a filter on the top to make it a little bit more blue. So it's the same thing that's burning. It's still not energy efficient, but they put a little bit bluer cast just by adding a filter on that top of the diffuser of the light. Make sense? So in general, blues will look desaturated and reds might be enhanced, okay, with this kind of a light source. For most of us, this is what we've grown up with in our house. We're very used to this kind of light source. As humans, evolutionarily, we're really used to warm lights, especially in the evening, because that's what the sun does, right? As the sun kind of goes down, dips past the horizon, it starts to get reddish, orangish, yellowish, right? That's what happens during sunset. So as humans, we're really used to having these in interior environments. Likewise, if you were used to having a fire, right, a fireplace in your house, the same thing would apply. Okay, questions about that? Because it only gets more complicated from here. Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Okay. The next one we have is white fluorescent. So here's two examples of fluorescent bulbs. The long fluorescent tubes. Yep.
Turn it on.
Okay, so I'm gonna show it to you, and then I'm gonna turn it on, but lean it down so it's not in everybody's eyeballs. Okay, so this happens to be a fairly cool color. So let me throw the white under here again. So under this fluorescent light, I have no idea what fluorescent light this is, and then under this fluorescent light. So if you can't see, go ahead and stand up so you can take a look. Okay. So if I just do this comparison, right, same panel. Okay? Right? Okay. Just so we get the point across a little bit. So you can have a really wide variety of spectrums for fluorescent lights. The other thing you'll notice is these are super spiky, right? They have energy in really discrete locations as opposed to being more of a broad spectrum. So the discrete locations come in regions where your eye's cone sensitivities are. So those cones are the things that detect light in your eye. Fluorescent lights are designed to excite those cones in really specific ways. that combine to be white in your eye. But what you'll find is, let's say you had a green. I don't know why you would have a lime green kitchen, but let's say you had a lime green kitchen and there's no energy in the lime green. It's going to look very different under this light source than it would under a broadband light source like an incandescent, because there's just no energy there to excite. So if you look at the top one, for example, if you had a yellow kitchen, which is not an uncommon kitchen color, you might find that the kitchen actually looks desaturated under these lights because there's just not any energy there to excite the color that you're seeing. Okay? These are typical of workplace bulbs. They tend to be cooler, but they do sell warm ones. I have some examples of warm ones with me. Colors can shift dramatically and erratically depending on which bulb you get. And unfortunately, most companies aren't very good about talking about how good their lights are. They're really good at telling you how energy efficient they are, or how many lumens or candelas, or how much physical light is hitting a surface, but they're not so great about telling you what their color is, because these are proprietary things sometimes, right? Which phosphors you choose might be a proprietary to you as a specific lighting person or lighting company, and so you may not want to publish this data. Instead, there's another metric you might publish, and some of them are even cagey about publishing that. So we'll talk about that one a little bit more too.
Question.
Sure.
So when you said whether it's a Kelly green, lime kitchen, or yellow, would not the color look more itself under the cooler light? Wouldn't the warmer light make both yellower?
Let's give it a go. Do we have anything kind of greenish? Oh, that's a great one. Okay, so greenish, right? Yellower?
Yeah. Oh, but it's still more green than it is under there.
Right.
So would you not prefer to use the cool light to make the color, to show the truer color?
So it really depends, and that's the really hard part.
Yeah, it's you have two different colors of green there. So what's your customer want?
Right. Does your customer?
Yeah.
What
What
do
do you sell them as green?
Right, and I think the other thing is, what are they comfortable in? Because this light, this sort of bluish light, frequently makes people feel awake and alert.
It's easier on the eye, I think, than the yellow light. We go through this at the office.
So for some people, yes, and for other people, no. And the other thing I will tell you is your age and the age of your customer actually matters.
Okay.
So as you age, your macula, everyone in the entire world's macula, starts to yellow. So you start to look through a yellow filter as you get older, every person in the world, okay? So the older your client is, the more likely they're going to see through a bit of a yellow filter. They're going to want more light in their space because they're seeing through filtered light, and the colors that they're seeing are going to be different than the younger person's colors. So if you have a, let's say, 20-something in the same room as their parent who, let's say, is 50-something, those two people are physically getting different light into their retina, and then therefore different light interpretations in their brain, which sometimes causes some challenges when we communicate about color, right? But it's also a challenge when you're specifying for someone. For an older customer, you might want to put more light into their kitchen so that they can see things a little bit better. I don't know that I would necessarily go with a bluer light, necessarily, depending on what they're used to. Because if you've grown up with this being what you have in your house your whole life, it may feel much more comforting to have this warmer light. And you may not have an objection to the fact that it's yellowing things. Whereas, if you're trying to distinguish the differences between three colors of peppers, it may be useful to have something that's a little bit more blue. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So it depends on the situation. Wish I could give you do this, but unfortunately that's not how it works. Did you have a question? Sorry. Okay. Okay. All right. Not all LEDs are created equal. I have a whole slew of LEDs at different price points and different qualities. We'll take a little break in a few minutes and have you play with them. Just put different bulbs in different lamps and see what it does to the color. You'll find that they shift very dramatically. And frequently when we're building these brand new, beautiful kitchens, we've spec'd everything to the nines except what light bulb's going into the fixture. And we can ruin how a kitchen looks by going with the bottom of the barrel light, unfortunately. And you've spent $10,000, $20,000 on this brand new kitchen reno, right? Between
Where are you living?
between the countertops and the flooring and everything else, right? And I'm thinking, you go into this, and then you're like, oh wait, I need fixtures for those under cabinet lights, or oh wait, I need lights for my candelabra, right? And I haven't thought it through, and I just go and pick the one that, let's say, my energy company is suggesting because they're really cheap and I can get a box of 5 for like $5. Or I go through and I pick just whatever's easiest to grab off the shelf without paying attention to what it is. And I can really screw up how things look. So here's some examples. Most LEDs that are white light LEDs are a combination of some sort of blue energy, which is really powerful, exciting a yellow phosphor. So they're a mixture of the actual LED technology with the phosphor technology from fluorescence. And that's why they have a sharp spike and then a hump. You can also have white LEDs that are like this, where it's a combination of red, green, and blue. These are becoming less and less common in the industry for really good reasons. But they do exist and they're still available. And we can play a little bit with the light and figure out what you guys think about this. And of course these come in those 2 color temperature ranges, the kind of warmer color temperature range and the bluer temperature range. And it just kind of depends on your specific client, what you've sold them and what they want in order to know which one to go with. So these 2 really don't look that dramatically different, right? In comparison to some of the other spectral power distributions I've shown you, they don't look that much different. What I'll tell you is that if you're selling anything red, anything that's even vaguely red, cherry, burgundy, anything with a red undertone, be really, really careful about using a low quality LED because it has almost no energy in the red. Higher quality LEDs do. The lower quality ones don't, and especially these red, green, blue ones, they just have energy in the wrong region to be able to really render bright reds well. So if you have somebody who's going for that, maybe that red barn style, I've seen a few of them, they're not quite as popular as they used to be, or a nice cherry finish, be very mindful about what LEDs they're using.
The 6500, kind of in the middle of the spectrum, going towards the cooler, would be more pleasing to the eye than more bright cooler?
So brighter than 6500, almost no one's going to sell, unless they're selling a grow bulb or something like that.
Countertops will grow.
I mean, if you've got a little herb garden on your countertop, maybe you need that. But I would just generally say no one's going to sell you above probably 5,000 in the industry. The reason for that is because once it gets brighter, it gets closer to midday, and we're not comfortable being in midday brightness in the middle of our interior environments, especially in the lighting, because we usually, and this probably varies from home to home, there's usually at least one window per kitchen, if not many, many windows per kitchen. And we would rather have the actual natural light than an artificial light. Does that make sense? For that really bright blue white. It's just more comfortable to us as humans to have the actual natural light in our space than it is to have it induced artificially. Do you want to be able to have these conversations with your customers or not?
they won't get it.
I mean, it depends on the person,
Right.
I think.
You can talk warm and cool.
You can talk warm and cool.
And stuff.
Yep, you can talk warm and cool. You can talk fluorescent versus LED. Most people at least have that. If you have them both in your showroom, you can go and take a person to those two experiences and talk about the differences.
Sure.
If you don't have them available in your showroom, all you're going to show them is the best of the best. So it's a decision your company has to make. Do we just show our product in the absolute best possible light all of the time? Or do we need to have these additional not so great lighting sources to be able to have the conversation with our customers? And I think that's maybe even a regional decision, because some customers are going to need that more than others. And maybe it's something where you bring out a gooseneck and have that conversation that way. Or maybe it's something where you bring them to a different part of your showroom and have that conversation that way. And I think it's a decision that you guys can make, but I can't tell you what the right one is.
That's a good idea.
You know, the big box stores have started doing that too. They have those little boxes. They're usually too small. They're like yay big for each light. It's not really enough room to put in a piece of granite or a door. You kind of want something that's probably bread box size for each light to really be able to get a good sense of being able to stick something in that light.
Okay.
Okay. So just a few take-homes about object color, and then we'll move on a little bit. Objects don't really have color. Color is not an innate property of an object. Color exists only in your brain. Objects either absorb or reflect certain wavelengths of light. So color exists in your brain and as a communication tool, a lexicon tool, but not in the actual object. So an object that's red reflects red light and absorbs everything else. You saw that in the LED demonstration that we did, right? Any other light I put on that besides something that had some red in it turns black, right? And we know that, right? We all experience it every single day. We try to ignore it as best we can, which is a good thing, because if we saw it all the time, it would be really jarring to us frequently to think our objects are magically changing in front of our eyes. Well, we know that they're not changing. The object itself is staying completely the same. It's the environment that's changing around it. Okay? And then I just reiterate that the color of an object is the brain's interpretation of the eye's sensation. So if you have different eyes than your colleague, and let's be honest, all of us have different eyes than our colleagues, we may have a disagreement about how something looks, even though the photons coming off of the object are identical. They may be received differently in our eyes, and they may be interpreted differently in our brains. So show of hands, who's ever disagreed about what to name a color? Right? It happens to all of us. I think it causes a lot of marital strife for no real good reason. So the sensation and perception of a stimulus is not the same for every human, right? So we know that there is an incidence, at least in the United States, of color blindness in men. 1 in 13 men in the United States is colorblind. In Asia, it's even higher. It's 1 in 10. And by Asia, I mean people of Asian descent. They've been the incidence of color blindness in men is directly related to when your population went from hunter-gatherer to agrarian. Because when you're a hunter-gatherer, you need to know if something's red or green in order to eat it, if it's healthy or not. And if it's not healthy, you die before you can procreate, and therefore your genes don't get passed down. In an agrarian society, your food is delivered to you. Most of the time, you don't have that issue. So that's the sad truth about color blindness. Yeah.
So if I was a hunter-gatherer, I'd be dead.
Well, we figured that.
Yes, it's in the eye itself. It's usually in the eye itself. So anytime there's a color anomaly, whether that's a complete color blindness, missing one cone class completely, or shifting of those cone sensitivities to be in a different region than the average person, that's all in the physical eye. That's all in the eye. That's not in the brain. You can have lots of things happen to your brain that can do all sorts of crazy things to your vision. Most of those things don't ever affect your color vision. There's a very, very specific neural pathways where color is communicated, And people that have deficiencies in those areas have a really specific pattern of brain deficiency if they do have those issues. Okay? But they're fairly uncommon. So if you hear of someone having a stroke and losing vision, usually they lose acuity, the ability to see, or they lose fields of vision or something like that. They don't usually just turn off their color. It happens sometimes, but it's pretty rare. Okay. The human eye is only capable of seeing color when there's enough light to see. So you have to have enough light. Everybody knows this, right? You go to bed, there you don't see any color. Everybody understands this, but we forget about it. So the same thing applies when we're in an environment. We want to make sure that we're providing enough light for our user to see what they're doing. And again, for older users, you need to provide more light for them to see the same thing as a younger user because of that filtering in their eye. So especially if you're designing a large-scale community like a nursing home environment or assisted living, anything like that, they frequently have brighter lights than the typical area so that their users can see better. So here's just kind of an example of how lighting can really change the color of objects. These are exactly identical objects in the two scenes. And you'll see that they're quite different. This is from a national standards body called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Measures. And they're looking into LEDs and how LEDs impact light here. So just to kind of drive the point home, depending on which light source you've got, your apple's going to look a little differently, and then what's supplied to your eye is going to be a little bit different. Not quite as dramatic on this screen as it is on mine, but
You can see the difference. It's browner at the top.
browner at the bottom, a little bit
Browner.
redder at the top. Just depends. So the way that the lighting industry has dealt with this in the past is something called the color rendering index. So you may have heard of CRI or seen CRI before. These are the colors that are used in CRI. Most of the time what people report and when they talk about CRI is this RA number, which is how well a light source renders those top colors in comparison to a standard incandescent or D65, which is the 6500 light source that we use in the industry. You'll see all those colors are fairly desaturated, right? They're not really bright colors. They're fairly pale. And so RA is not the best indicator most of the time of how well something's really rendering. Sometimes R9 is reported. So LEDs, like I said, have really big problems with red. So that R9 score is something to pay attention to because LEDs don't do a great job of rendering reds generally, and especially not really bright reds. So if somebody's trying to sell you a really high quality LED, they're going to tell you the R9 score. And this is only usually if they're really prideful about how high quality their LED is. Because most LEDs really don't have good R9 scores. And then RE is for all of the colors together. So if you take an average of the differences of all of the colors, that's what that RE value is. Because this metric relates back to kind of traditional light sources, some people don't really think it's a really great metric. Because if you're comparing to an incandescent bulb, which isn't the best bulb in the world anyway, why should we bother? So there's a couple alternatives out there. The most common obviously is still CIERA. Higher is probably better. It's a scale from some low number to 100. I've seen as low as 60 on the market before. TM30RF is a fidelity metric, color fidelity. How true is the color to itself? The most rare is TM30RG, and kind of somewhere in between is the TM30 icon, which is just a visual variety. Okay, so that's what this one down here is. So you'll see this is kind of a color plot where it shows you the difference between the absolute and what this particular light source does to the color. So you'll see that it's a little bit redder and a little bit greener for this particular light source than the standard best rendering light source would be. These are not very common. There are a few companies who've adopted them, but for the most part, this is too much color for the average consumer. So these don't show up most places. But if you get a company that's reporting any of these, or if you want to know what they are, most companies will give you the data if you ask for it. So we'll just talk a little bit about some lighting in some kitchens. So these are Sherwin-Williams styles. I also have some Showplace styles on our next slide. But just to kind of show you the challenge of matching lighting in a kitchen, right? So I've circled in red all of the different sources of light in these kitchens. Right? So obviously you can't do anything about the window, because the window's going to do what the window's going to do, right? It may be really bright, it may be really dark, it may have tons of trees around it, it may be completely open. There's not much you can do to handle that light. That light's going to do what it's going to do. However, you can match the recessed fixtures and the under cabinet fixtures and the candelabra type fixtures and have them all be in the same space. So all warm, all cool, a mixture of warm and cool if that's what your client wants for some specific reason. I wouldn't suggest it in most cases. It's not really a good way to go, but oh, I probably forgot one. There's probably an under range light there too. So just kind of keeping in mind that where the lights are in the space is going to have a pretty dramatic effect on how the cabinets look, right? So if we look in that top left image of this kind of, probably pretty close to that Dover white, you'll see that, let's see if I can use my little arrow here, that the white here is quite different in color than the white over here. And that's just natural variation of the lighting in this space on the cabinets themselves. Right? And if I look at this inside cabinet lighting, which I also didn't circle, I apologize, that we're also going to get kind of a dramatic shift of the color of the cabinet as well. Does that make sense? Okay. It's not as pertinent in these kind of darker woods. Especially kind of these blacks, because black just doesn't reflect light very much. But in the more brown colors,
There you go.
right? Get a really big glare from that light, right? And that might be a good thing, it might not be a good thing, depends on what you're trying to do. But if it's not matched with, let's say, where's my little eye?
Comes and goes.
Sorry about that. If this light up here isn't matched, let's say, with the light coming over here, it's going to look kind of strange, right? Yeah.
If the cabinets up above on the right, if they're black and black absorbs more light, would you use the higher Kelvin light in there to keep it brighter?
I think it depends on what the contrast you're looking for is. So in this particular vignette, they've gone with really contrasty, right? They have white countertops, white walls, kind of greenish backsplash behind the oven there as their accent. They're looking for that really big contrast between light and dark. And in those cases, it doesn't matter what light you put in there, it's gonna show that contrast. If you were looking for gradational steps, the difference between a stark black and a cherry, or the difference between a stark black and a walnut type finish, you might want something a little bit bluer. So here's some Showplace photos. I'm sure you guys are familiar. But again, we're talking about matching light, right? So if the under cabinet light here isn't matched with the recessed fixture, you're going to get a pretty dramatic difference in how your different cabinets look. Right? This one I pulled from your website because it's kind of dramatic, right? You can tell that the under cabinet lighting is super blue in that photo, right?
Yeah.
Super, super blue. Whereas the recessed lighting is pretty yellow white, right? Pretty neutral white, as well as the under range fixture, right? So in that particular case, that might be okay. And because you have a nice blue evening window out there, I think it's fairly well matched. But that might not have been the best aesthetic decision for the long range goal of your cabinet. So this is going to be my main points on lighting. I have a couple of other things If you guys want, I have a brief explanation of the dress, which I get asked about all the time. We can talk about that if you want to. Or we can just not talk about it. But I'm going to do a couple of kind of fun color things to keep your mind in color and to make you aware of things that maybe you don't pay attention to most of the time. Okay? So all of you feel like you're color savvy today?
Sure.
Okay. In your brain, identify this color. Remember what it is. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. Think about what it is. Make sure you know what it is. You don't have to name it. You don't have to give it a class. Just remember what it looks like. Which one is it?
Oh, gosh.
Pick one. D? Okay.
B.
I would say E.
All right, you guys ready for the big reveal?
What? Yesterday.
Oh, wow.
Here's the big reveal.
Step it back one. Let me see it again.
There it is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God.
Okay, so firstly, why was it hard? Give me some examples of why you think it was hard.
Too many different shades.
A lot of similar shades, too many other colors.
Because purple doesn't exist.
Because purple doesn't, okay, yep, valid point. Okay, so here's a couple of things. When colors are touching one another, we don't see them as true as they are when they're standing alone. Also, the background of a color is a really important thing. So you want to make sure that when you're displaying your colors, you're doing so on a neutral background, whether that's white, gray, or black. Usually gray is the best one, but you want to display your colors on the most neutral background you can so that the color around doesn't influence the color of the object, whatever that color of the object is.
So, should you do it on black or white?
Black, white, or gray. Gray probably would be my preference, but black or white works too. Also, when you're in a sea of other colors, frequently those colors influence one another and that can create an issue. The other issue is color memory is really bad for most people. There are some people who are really great at it. They can get this every single time. There are some people, and most people, I would say easily 75%, even if I showed this to you in 6 months, you'd still get it wrong, right? Most people's color memory encourages them to pick something that is more chromatic, more colorful, and also brighter than the actual thing that they were asked to remember, okay? It's the same thing in things that you see short and things that you see long, right? So if I asked you guys in lieu of a Coke can to pick the color of a Coke can, you'd likely pick something that was redder and brighter than the actual Coke can. And as you should probably know, Coke is really, really, really choosy about what color their red Coke cans are, right? As are most brand colors. So shouldn't be a surprise. But something to keep in mind, if ever you're trying to compare to something or somebody wants to match something that they're bringing in from home, let's say, or they're trying to match to our countertop sample and they don't have it in front of them, relying on their color memory is not usually the best way to go. It's usually better to have them bring it into the store and actually look at it all in the same space. And I think we know that of our customers, but let's remember that of ourselves too, right? In your brain, that Dover white might be different than it actually is in the real world. So it's just easier to just go grab it, make sure you have it in front of you before you start down that path. So whenever we do color matching decisions, on the paint side of things, we do everything in neutral gray in a light booth in order to control those things.
What's your definition of neutral gray?
Neutral gray is called N15, so Munsell definition N15. I don't know if you guys know Munsell system. It's a color system. We can talk about it in a little bit. So these two pink dots look like they're the same color or not?
They don't look like it, but they are.
They are, but they don't look the same. It's a phenomenon called simultaneous contrast. It's, again, what we were talking about just before, that when you have two colors that are next to each other, sometimes they compete. And they may look brighter or dimmer depending on which ones you have next to each other. There's a really great book by a guy named Joseph Albers. It was written a long time ago, called The Interaction of Color. The Interaction of Color is a really great book if you ever want to investigate why these different phenomena occur, why colors can shift and move when they're next to each other like that. This one is an after image test. I'm sure you guys have seen these before. If you look at the black dot in the center and stare for about 10 seconds, then shift your eyes over to the tree. Let you give it a try. So the idea here is that the longer you stare at a color, the more what you call retinal fatigue happens. So your eye just kind of gets used to that color and kind of discounts the fact that it's there. And then it takes that retinal fatigue signal with it wherever it goes. So if you're trying to make color decisions or you're trying to match colors, it's important that you move your eyes around and you don't stare directly at the color for too long, or you can have this retinal fatigue phenomenon that's going to actually change the color you're looking at. Okay, can we assign a name to each one of these colors? Just think about it in your head, write it down if you've got a piece of paper and you want to. Just kind of go through the list.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
Okay, you probably fit into one of these two categories. Either you wanted to come up with a unique name for every single color, brick, ruby, maroon, mauve, purple. You don't have to agree with the names here. Just you either fall into one of these camps or you fall into a camp like this, which is these are all reds and one's darker and lighter and brighter, or dark, dimmer, or this is green or yellow or green or something like that. So you either fall into a camp of lumped or split. So show of hands who fell into the split camp. Okay, anybody fall into the lump camp? Okay, so you can train a lumper to split. It's really hard to train a splitter to lump. A lot of us in this industry, especially in paint and color, are really good at splitting up colors because we're trained to do it every single day. The difference between that bright white and the Dover white and all the different names of colors you guys have, because you have a wealth of them and so do we, we're used to splitting up colors into specific names. But we need to understand that there are a lot of people in the world that are lumpers. Generally, lumpers tend to be men, and generally, splitters tend to be women. There are people who cross that gap all the time, but generally that's how the divide goes. And part of that is a cultural association. So little girls from the time they're small get trained in things like cosmetics and encouraged in art and encouraged in fashion. And in those worlds, specific color differentiation is really important, because how would you know which one of the 36 lipstick colors you need if it doesn't have a unique name, or which one of the 25 nail polish colors you want to put on if it doesn't have a specific name? So those industries train females to be more likely to be splitters than to be lumpers. Again, it goes both ways, but that's kind of the impetus behind it. And it's a really common human tendency to classify our sensorial experiences this way. So we do it with music, we do it with pain and sensation, we do it with taste all the time. We like to classify things into groups, just kind of part of the human experience. Color names is standard convention. It's an agreed upon standard. You have to, in the entirety of the US, you have to know 10 basic color names to get out of kindergarten, or you don't pass kindergarten, right? It's also a good way for them to identify people who might be color anomalous. But it's in most educational curriculums. Again, not all people perceive things the same way. The point here that it's not necessarily consistent across languages or cultures is a really important point. In the United States, we have a really cross-cultural sort of world, right? We live with people of all different ethnicities and cultures who have just come to the United States and whose families have been here for years and years. And that poses a challenge because color in language is a really challenging thing. If you want more information about how color in language happens, we can certainly talk about that. But I'll just preface this by saying that color in language is very imprecise. And I think you probably have all experienced that. depending on what region somebody comes from, their experience of color may be different, and also their preferences about color may be different, which I'm sure you've all experienced as well. And a lot of that has to do with ethnic and regional things, but can also do with climate. How many people have been to equatorial regions of the world? Let's say the Bahamas, Mexico, India, Africa. So in all of those cultures in the kind of middle of the world, bright colors are really preferred. And part of that is because you can see more bright colors because there's literally more photons coming from the sun hitting the earth in those equatorial regions of the world. And so those cultures evolved to like more bright colors because they can experience them. Whereas if you look at the color trend in, let's say, Scandinavia, it tends to be pretty neutral, right? Fairly white. Because they just physically have fewer photons hitting the surface of the earth there. And so their culture kind of evolved in a different way. It's the same with all sorts of cultures that way. But it's something to keep in mind when we're dealing with clients, especially clients who are recent arrivals to the United States, that might be something to pay attention to. All right, so here are some objects. Can somebody throw out some color words to describe these colors?
Mustard.
Okay.
Bright.
Bright. What else?
Yellow.
Yellow. Okay.
Gold.
Gold.
So my red is
Anybody else?
There are headlights, I guess, that are red.
Okay. How about this one?
Yellow.
How is this one different than this one?
Brighter.
Brighter.
Lighter.
Lighter. More contrast.
softer.
Softer. Okay. We heard some of these. Here's just some other examples some people have used.
Orangish.
Orangish. Like this frog might be orangish in comparison to the flower. What are these objects trying to communicate with the colors that they have? So 2 of them are natural objects. 1 of them is a not natural object, but it's probably also trying to communicate something with its color. What kind of things do you think this frog is trying to communicate with its color? What's its purpose for being that color? Blend in, maybe.
Camouflage.
Could also be to stand out, right? Depending on its environment.
Or definitely.
Poisonous. Stay away from me. Please don't eat me. What about this rose?
Softness.
Okay.
Elegance. Beauty.
Beauty. What's its evolutionary purpose for being yellow? Attract bees, right? It wants to be pollinated. What about the Ferrari? Firstly, is that a typical Ferrari color?
No. Well,
No.
yes, can be. Usually
That's
red, silver, or
Red,
black.
red, silver, or black. Those are the standard colors. So this is not a standard Ferrari color. Why might someone paint their Ferrari this color?
Stand out.
To stand out? Be different? Express themselves in some way, right? Yeah, exactly. Find the right one. So all of these objects are more or less in the same color palette, but they're all communicating something different for different purposes. And I think if you were trying to describe the difference between these, you might find it to be a challenge, right? You could come up with some words, but would they be actionable words to go back to the kitchen, the pink kitchen, and do something with, right? How do you communicate to from the design team to the technical team, okay, I need it to be 10% more yellow, or I need it to be brighter, or it's too pale, right? What does that tell the technical team to do? So I told you to talk a little bit about the Munsell system. The Munsell system was one of the first adopted color systems. It's still used in the United States. By show of hands, who's heard of Munsell system? Yes? Okay. The Munsell system basically divides color into 3 dimensions. What it does is it has a hue or a named color on each page. It has value vertically, and it has chroma horizontally. And just kind of illustrate what those 3 are. Value is more or less lightness, how dark or light something is. Chroma is how colorful, and then hue is what color denotion it is. Okay? And I brought with me some examples of what that looks like. So there are these pages of colors. They're actually paint chips. Oh, yeah. Hold them up a little bit, sorry. So you can kind of see, this is just a small sample of how they differentiate. But this gives a technical person a really clear direction of where to go to get what you're trying to achieve. Okay? It's not really what we use in modern color. This is probably an ancestral to what we use today, which is the CIE-LAB equations. Don't worry about the math. You don't have, it's not a test at the end, I promise. But basically the axes are the same. Lightness, greenness, redness, and yellowness, blueness. So L, A, and B are the three axes. They kind of make a sphere of color, or a space of color. Looks kind of like this. So this is how we in technical specify color. So it's really helpful to us if a designer comes to us and they want something slightly different than what's currently available, either to have a physical sample for us to match, that would be the gold standard, or to be able to give us a direction in these sorts of coordinate terms in order to know what direction we want to go. All right, so I'm going to give you a few key takeaways, and then we can talk about the dress if you really want to. We have a few more minutes. So here's the 3 key takeaways. If you take away nothing else from what we did today but this, these are the 3 things. Be mindful about your lighting choices. The ones you make and the ones you encourage others to make. So what you do in your showroom and what you encourage your customers to do in their homes. Don't rely on your color memory to make decisions. And do your best to communicate as effectively about color using precise words. So those are the 3 big takeaways for today. Okay, questions I can address right now? You guys really want to talk about the dress?
Sure.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just go back to the previous slide.
Sure.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does this make sense?
So you start in the center with the gray, and then
Yep.
your colors spread from there.
Correct. You get more colorful as you go out. I actually think I have a, one second, I have a representation of that. So it's kind of collapsed in my bag here, but this is what's called a color globe. If I can get it to flatten out without destroying it. What? Okay. Here we go. I'm missing a sheet. Okay, so more or less like this, right? Where the neutral colors are in the center, really colorful on the outside,
More saturated.
more saturated on the outside. Okay, make sense? So that's kind of how, in the color science world, we deal with color, is in a color space, a defined color space. And this is the color space that is used probably in 75 to 80% of the industries that have specifications related to color, including ours. Okay?
So I noticed there's no whites in there when you just go to the lighter gray.
So what the absolute white is at the top, the tippy top,
Black is
and black is at the very bottom. Is white a color? White is all colors. White is the color of the light. Quite literally the color of the light. And black is the absence of light. So by technical definition, no, white and black are not technically colors. They are perceptions. So it just depends on how you look at it.
So when we make paint, whether it's at Sherwin or at Show Place, and we use the color at the computer to read the color, this is what they use, the C-Lab. So you'll get a value of light, dark, of blue, yellow, red.
Mm-hmm.
And if we, like at SW, we have to be within half a delta or whatever our parameters are for you
Yeah, I
guys.
don't
And
remember.
there's a big formula taking into
Yeah,
account
and
those 3 reads off of a 16-point color curve that will tell us if we're in there. And it'll
Yep.
tell us if we're on the yellow side, then we need to add blue to move it. If we're on the green side, red, vice versa. Those are the 4 colors we use to adjust color. There's
Right.
no pigment that's purple.
Which are the primary.
Or, yes. And then we use white and black to basically adjust
Light,
light,
dark,
dark.
Right.
So how do you achieve purple?
Red and blue.
Well, I'm saying, in the way you're mixing it
Sorry, I didn't mean to-
Doesn't exist.
So-
Honestly, yeah, there is no.
So there's a couple ways.
That's
So
why I'm asking. That's
so
what
here's
I'm
the challenge. In color space, purple is a really challenging region of color space. So if you were to ever ask us for a purple, it would take us a little bit of time to get it perfect. Because
Unless we give you a match, something to match to.
if you give us something to match to, we're way more likely to get right on the money really fast. If you ask us generally for something in the reddish purple region or something like that,
Bluish purple.
right, there's a lot more communication that has to happen back and forth between the two parties till we get to the right answer, especially in purples. There are other regions where that's the case too, but purple kind of bends in this color space. It kind of has this kind of C-shaped curve in C-Lab color space, and because of that, sometimes the numbers in purple don't really give us good indications of direction when you communicate this visual, because this is all numbers game. This is a numbers game. It's not a visual game. So the numbers could look perfect, but visually it doesn't look good. We still have to go back and do it again, right? Or the numbers could look horrible, but visually it looks really great. We're going to continue to give it to you with the caveat that the numbers aren't going to look good. And this is just because we're trying to fit a mathematical thing onto some sort of brain perception thing, and that's not a perfect mapping. It isn't for anything, right? If you ever listen to auto-tune, there are certainly people who are really in tune with music who can really tell when an auto-tune is being used, because that auto-tune is mathematical fit to the music in order to make it fit within the rest of the track. So it's the same thing with our other experiences too, right? If you've ever tasted something that's like a grape candy, right? A grape candy doesn't taste like a grape, right? It tastes completely different. It's its own kind of special entity in the world. Or like cherry cough syrup, right? It doesn't really taste like a cherry necessarily. It's that mapping between that mathematical thing and the physical thing is a little bit off. And so that has some distinction in color too. And Sherwin-Williams is really good about putting as many controls in place as we can to make sure that we get you what you've asked for and that we keep open lines of communication, which is why we have people in your factory every day whenever you guys need us to help you get what you've asked for.
Yeah, if you really want to frustrate a painter or color guy, tell him it needs more purple or orange.
Orange and purple are probably the worst.
And
Or
green
browns
shades
are
of
really
off.
hard for
Oh,
us
browns,
too.
yeah.
Browns are really hard for us because brown is a non-spectral color, right? It's kind of somewhere in the dark orangey, yellowy,
Between
reddy.
orange and black, I would think.
Yeah, it's really kind of a weird spot to define. So the colors that are really distinct are very easy for us. The ones that are kind of in those in-between regions can be more challenging. Grays sometimes, especially grays with undertones, can be really challenging for us too.
And we make tints and pigments that are, like we have a few different shades of yellow. We have a green shade yellow
Right.
and an orange, or a red shade yellow, which to you guys you'd probably call orange. But the more tints or pigments we use to make a color, the harder it is. So we keep it basic, get it close, and then
Yep.
adjust from there.
Right. We try to keep it simple, stupid. Right. That's our
Yeah.
motto.
That's what I always say.
Right? Okay. The dress, in case you were wondering. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. Okay, show of hands who thinks it's white and yellow, or white and
color?
gold. White and gold? Blue and black? I'm not sure. Okay.
White and gold.
White and gold.
That is a white.
We'll talk.
No,
We'll talk about it.
like-
We'll talk about it.
The light.
It looks white and
It's
gold.
okay. We'll talk about it.
Fluorescent.
Okay.
I see no blue.
Hold on, sorry. Okay. So you'll see that there's two lights in this picture, right? There's a light at the top and there's a light at the bottom.
Yep.
And you'll see, since we've been talking about light today, that the light color of those two lights is very different. Yeah?
Yep.
Everybody agree with that? Okay. So if I just cut the picture and you only see the light at the top, this is the color you might see. If I cut the picture and you only see the light at the bottom, this is the color you might see. If I adjust the color of the dress itself to the lower light setting, this is the colors you see. If I instead adjust it to the light at the top, this is the colors you might see. Okay? So depending on which light source your brain chose as the accurate light source, interpreted what colors you saw the dress to be. Okay? So, as much as we love our cell phones and our iPads and all of our technology and all of our rendering devices, having a client bring in a picture on a phone is almost as useless as having them bring nothing at all because of this issue, right?
Yep.
And even all of those color measuring devices, we have a Color Snap app, for example, that we use. You can suffer from the same issue, which is that it makes an assumption somewhere in that image that something is the white. And if the algorithm assumes incorrectly what is the white, then the rest of the colors will be off as a result of that fact. So they may not be as true to color as you expect them to be, which is why when a customer comes into one of our thousands and thousands of stores, we have to continue to have that conversation with the customer to say, yes, we understand that this is what you got and this is what you think you have and you may take it home, but please paint a little bit on your wall and make sure it is really the color you want before you commit to doing the whole house in that color. So we always encourage people to put a sample in their space because the lighting of their space can also has a really big impact as well. On each wall.
The way the light
Mhm.
hits it
Correct.
at different times of day.
Correct. And you kind of need to be in the space at different times of day as well.
Okay, so does it mute out the color? Because what if they're painting over a yellow wall? So would you,
Mhm.
so would you suggest doing your gray first and then doing the test samples?
Yes, generally speaking, you'd either need to prime that wall to white or
Sure.
gray, depending on what it is, or something like that. Neutralize the wall first. Yeah. Yeah, you can just get a white primer or just do a white square and then paint whatever accent color they want over that white.
Purple's really hard.
Purple's really
It's
hard.
really hard. I went through that
Black
with
and
a
white
client.
stripes are really hard too. If you have a person who did black and white stripes or who did a black chalkboard wall, chalkboard paint's really a pain in the butt to try to get over it too. But anyway, that would be my suggestion is please don't rely on the color on a screen. Have a physical object. I know it's a pain in the butt to carry around a ton of physical objects, but I'm telling you this because things like this happen because one just happened again, right? Everybody see the color changing shoe? Right, so this is from the website. This is the actual shoe from the website. This is just a picture somebody took on their cell phone.
No.